We'd like to spend a little bit of time feeling good about this country again. And to that end, let's focus on a brand new book. It's called Side by Side in Eternity: The Lives Behind Adjacent American Military Graves. We've got the author, James McNeal, a retired admiral from the U.S. Navy. Thanks for joining us, Admiral.
Really happy to be here with you, Larry.
This is a fascinating premise for the book. I had no idea this was even a thing. So there are members of the military who have fallen in service to the nation, and they are buried side by side with their comrades. Is that it?
Well, there's some of those stories. What's really fun about the book is that there's many different stories, and what we try to do as the narrative is we have folks who chose to be buried side by side. Why did they do that? What was special about the relationship? In some cases, why did they choose to be buried somewhere different? For example,
Hmm.
Apollo 1, the astronauts are not buried together. Why was that? And when we look through this, we also look at what's the bigger narrative. So we tried to make it an interesting story, kind of at the micro level, but then from a macro level, what was interesting, and we think we did a pretty good job. Obviously, our readers will have to be the ones to determine that.
I saw the first chapter focuses on the famed 54th Regiment out of Massachusetts. This is the Civil War regiment that was featured in the famous movie Glory. Tell me that
Correct.
story.
So, for those that don't know the story, Colonel Shaw from Boston was put in charge of an all black unit, and they were sent down to South Carolina, and he was told to take a Confederate fort. He fell, unfortunately, in trying to take that fort. And in the Civil War, there was a certain amount of respect for both sides. So if an officer fell on either side, whether it was the Union or the Confederate side, the side would return the body as a sign of respect. But the Confederates did not want to show that same respect to Colonel Shaw because he was leading these black troops. And so they let him just fall with his men, and they buried him in a mass grave. And a lot of folks were outraged, and Colonel Shaw's parents said, no, that's what they want, where they wanted him to be, and they wanted him to lie for forever with his soldiers. They did try to exhume the body later, but by then it was there was no way to determine the remains. But so an act of disrespect that the Confederates tried to do actually was exactly what the Shaw family wanted done, including his wife.
Such a great story. Admiral, when we're at war, when we're in combat, these warriors, these men and women who fight for us and fight around the world for American ideals, did they talk about this amongst themselves? They listen. If I die, I want to be buried here. I want to be buried with you. Is this topic of conversation?
Well, I'm not sure if it is. I think that most people feel, hey, I don't want to talk about that. I know that in our story about Apollo 1, Ed White is not buried with the other two Apollo 1 astronauts. For those who don't know the story of Apollo 1, it was the spacecraft that had a fire on the launching pad, and all three astronauts unfortunately died in that fire. And the other two astronauts are buried in Arlington, and NASA wanted Ed White to also be buried in Arlington with the other two astronauts. But when they called Mrs. White, and I did an interview with Ed White's son, who was 13 at the time, which is an
Oh,
absolutely phenomenal experience to speak to that gentleman. But he said, "Yeah, mom, and dad had talked about it, and Ed White had already done some space travel. That he said, if anything ever happens, I want to be buried at West Point. He was a West Point grad. I want to be
oh.
buried in the West Cemetery." So NASA went to Mrs. White and said, "Okay, we want to have everybody buried together," and she said, "Absolutely not. He's going to be buried in West Point per his request."
Wow. Uh, that's so. It's amazing to me that these are such rich stories, and obviously, it's something that appeals to a lot of people. They want to read this for inspiration and for historical purposes. Were you surprised when you began researching the book that it hadn't been told yet? This is a book I'm shocked hasn't already been written.
Well, the original idea came because I saw Senator McCain and Admiral Larson at the Naval Academy Cemetery were buried side by side. And my original idea was to do a book about their friendship. Admiral Larson was brigade commander, retired four-star admiral, while Senator McCain had obviously a wonderful life of service, a very famous senator, POW in Vietnam. He was also fifth from the bottom of his class at the Naval Academy. And so the fact that Senator McCain and Admiral Larson were best friends, I thought was an interesting story. And there's been other stories, other books where they just centered on one set of folks that decide to be buried side by side. What we decided to do was get some other stories that maybe weren't book length, but had very unique things, and stories that we could tell to the public that maybe weren't as well known.
Admiral, you mentioned the Naval Academy and the hallowed ground there, where graduates of the Naval Academy have been laid to rest for eternity. I know that a building was just renamed after former President Jimmy Carter, who was a Naval Academy grad, the only Naval Academy grad to become president. And we also learned just yesterday that his family has now brought him home, and he's receiving home hospice care. When a member of a military academy, either West Point or the Naval Academy in the case of President Carter, when they become a president, that sort of cements that person in sort of this historic legend with the school, with the academy. Is that part of the conversation in Annapolis about former President Jimmy Carter? Because he's still longest living president in history. He's still with us as of now, but it looks like his death may be imminent.
Yeah, and it is a shame. He's had such a wonderful life. I read something this morning. He's the first U.S. president born in a hospital, which
Huh.
shows you how old he is. But I think when you look at President Carter, you look at someone who dedicated his life to service, not only to the Navy and the nation as a submarine officer, but also the governor of Georgia, a president, and you could maybe make the case that he accomplished more after his presidency with all of his charitable work, very big in Habitat for Humanity. I just think it goes to show that the Naval Academy and the service academies in general are not just about serving in the military. They're designed to train young men and women for careers of service, regardless of where it is, whether it's in the military or out of the military. And that's why you see service academy graduates having success and really being the leaders in our community across a wide variety of industries.
And I think as partisan and political as we often get on this program, it's also important to step aside for a moment and take a cue from the military, where they raise young men and women to serve their nation, as you said, and to do something very hard for many of us, which is to set aside politics in that goal.
Yeah, the military is we have a commander in chief, and that commander in chief can be one party or the other, but that doesn't matter. There's a chain of command, and really when we take an oath. In fact, I teach sophomore leadership at the Naval Academy, and coincidentally, this week we're going to be talking about the oath of office. So we don't take an oath of office to a political party. We take an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Yep.
And that's what it is all about.